The post-pandemic world is the subject of our next conversation between former U.S. President Bill Clinton and former British Prime Minister Tony Blair. The two are old friends. They worked together while in office, and in this conversation, they share their perspectives on the central challenges of the 21st century and the possible solutions.
Hello, everyone. First, I'd like to thank Mayor Mike Bloomberg and his team for inviting Prime Minister Blair and me to say a few words and try to answer a few questions. I think we should get right into the program. So, Tony, we've just been through a period of increased separatist nationalism. Do you think that this epidemic and the requisite responses to it and its aftermath will lead to more scattershot responses as we've had, or more global cooperation? And if so, how should we achieve it?
Okay, first of all, it's a great pleasure to be at the Bloomberg Forum, and my thanks to Mike Bloomberg, and of course, a great pleasure and honor to be with President Clinton. So, look, it should mean that the world recognizes if it's a global pandemic, the response to it has been pretty haphazard. Actually, the absence of global cooperation has been shocking, really. And my view is if we had cooperated together as a world, we'd probably be 2 or 3 months ahead of this. So where we are now. So I would have thought that most people would believe that since these global pandemics may be a thing of the future as well, it's very clear from the analyses that I've seen and the discussions I've had with various people in different countries, not just the UK, but also in the US, in Europe, people in China, indeed. The danger of pathogens such as this morphing into something that is going to be globally menacing is significant. So I think it would be very sensible if, as a result of this, we now looked at how we could improve the global architecture to make ourselves much more effective at dealing with this next time. So we're not scrabbling around for protective equipment, trying to get vaccines, therapeutics, tests. I mean, if you just take testing, for example, I mean, obviously everyone is now recognizing that testing, mass testing is an essential part of this. But you think if countries had come together and innovated to get more rapid tests instead of using the gold standard PCR test, or rapid tests right at the beginning, we could probably have developed them months ago instead of them just coming on stream now. So I think that every country will look after its own interests first in something like this in terms of protecting their people. But it's so obvious as a matter of enlightened self-interest that you would be much better off if countries came together when a global pandemic such as this hits, because it's global in nature and everyone's facing the same problem. And I guess, I don't know what you think about this, Bill, but I think the question really is, what are the differences to global architecture that are necessary? And do you think that the political will is there in order to be able to do this?
Well, we don't know yet, but I think so. I think the United States expressing its desire, or President-elect Biden expressing his desire and intention to immediately shelve the efforts to withdraw from the World Health Organization and to re-enter the Paris Climate Accord and do things that will put America back in the business of working with other countries. I think that will help. But I also think there are some practical things we can do that should engender widespread support. You know, the most important success, arguably, in global investment in the last 20 years has been the broad-scale commitment to public health, from President Bush's PEPFAR program to the Global Fund on AIDS, TB, and Malaria, to Gavi, to, you name it. And we ought to have a global network of supply stockpiles for these emergencies. The big countries, of course, need their own. But I remember in the 90s when I set up the first stockpile designed to deal with biological as well and chemical and other problems. It was in its infancy. It was a new idea, but it's been modernized and it's gone up and gone down. It's not had consistent support. But everybody knows now that America was humiliated, basically leaving the states, rattling a tin cup and competing against one another, trying to get basic PPE. So I don't think we'll do that again. I think we will support what is necessary for ourselves, and then we need to support the WHO or whatever the designated supervisory entity is in setting these up regionally around the world, so we don't have this again. We'll have the capacity to produce quickly and to distribute quickly and in an equitable way.
Yeah, I think that's obviously true. I mean, I think there's two questions really. First of all, will people want to see greater global cooperation? And secondly, if they do, then what do you do with it? And I think on the first, it's interesting, my institute did some polling recently on attitudes to globalization and found that even amongst, say, Brexit supporters in the UK or supporters of President Trump in the US, there were actually significant majorities in favor of cooperation on things like health. I mean, many of the therapeutic drugs that are now coming onto the market, there's only limited production of them. You're dependent on certain countries for very large percentages of certain key commodities that are necessary in the supply chain. And then I think there's a whole question to do with how you have some common standards around this. I mean, I think, for example, it's very hard for me to see how you get international travel going again unless you have some common set of standards on what people will expect to know about you when you come into their country. So I think one of the things I'm seeing, for example, in Africa at the moment, in the work that we do there, is a real desire to accelerate the use of data and technology, because otherwise they can't see how they're going to get reconnected to the global community. So I would have thought, since this pandemic has created something that will be around for some time. I mean, most people I speak to, I don't know what you think about this, Bill, but most people I speak to say, no, we're going to be living with this for some years. Then you're going to probably need, if you're going to be traveling, you're going to need to show some sort of like a biometric ID almost. You're going to need to show what your vaccination status is and probably what your testing status is.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think this could be actually a positive thing, because it will lead to greater levels of cooperation that nearly everybody will support. And I think that if there's one thing we've learned in the Brexit battle and the questions involving Scottish independence, all the things you've dealt with, and the larger role of separatist nationalism in the politics of the last few years, it is that specificity is our friend. That is, if it's something specific that makes sense that people can see they benefit from, they will support globalization and cooperation. And if the specifics are things they find immensely threatening, they won't. But if they don't know one way or the other, and it just sounds like, let's cooperate, then it's easy to fill the gap with fears, and easier with fears than hopes, and they're more powerful in that context. So I think there's a great opportunity as well as a responsibility for the global community to develop a global public health network and sensible responses. I also think, apropos of what you said, it is quite possible, depending on how the vaccines work out, that at least in the interim, this will be like the worst viral threat we've faced in our lifetime, HIV. That is, that we'll develop an antiretroviral. That's what the monoclonal antibodies are that President Trump received. In effect, it hastens your recovery. And unlike AIDS, this is something you can get over, but it stays with you in your body. Hastens your recovery, keeps you off of ventilators, out of hospitals, and away from death's door. I think that once we have that, you can make that widely available, and that will make a huge difference also. I also think it will dramatically reduce the side effects of infection.
So if it's clear that you need to build the capacity to cooperate much more strongly for the future around global health preparedness, let's say, what's your take? Because both of us dealt with the G7 stroke G8, but not really. Always the G20 was just coming into being at the end of my time. But you've got the G20 and you've got the G7, and the problem with the UN systems is that they tend to be quite difficult to get to consensus and to move fast, and there's a lot of bureaucracy around them for obvious reasons. So it always seems to me, if you're going to look at where does the opportunity to construct a better global architecture, you're going to either start with the G7 or the G20, but then you come to the G20, which is obviously much more. Because G7 is Western countries, G20 is much more representative of the way the world is today. But how are we going to get the cooperation going that we need when obviously not just America's relationship with China, but the West's relationship with China is so difficult?
Well, I think that question will be able to be answered a little bit better when we see what happens after the change of government in the United States, how they decide to deal with China, how they decide to manage our clear disagreements over Hong Kong and the camps for the Uyghurs and the desperate need to work together for global development, to fight climate change, to deal with the COVID-19. But I think once we have a sense of that, then I believe that whatever the appropriate way of dealing with it is, you need an organized effort that begins with the end in mind. I mean, I thought when, after I left the White House and Ban Ki-moon was Secretary General of the United Nations, I thought we had a pretty good deal with the Millennium Development Goals. When you could get people to agree with the end, then you could give them flexibility in how to get to the end. And it was easier to help people who were clearly committed to it. When I worked with then Secretary General Ban Ki-moon in the aftermath of the tsunami, we got all kinds of help from all kinds of places in different ways. But we managed the respect for the sovereignty of all the affected countries, and they could channel it in different ways. And we got an enormous amount done. And it was done in a way that also permitted private sector participation and NGO participation. So we can do this if there is a sense that the major forces at play in the world can agree on the end in mind.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, I think for the new administration in the US, I think the big challenge with China is to get what I would call a strategic framework for dealing with China, rather than a series of ad hoc reactions to whatever the Chinese may be doing. And I don't know what you think about this, but I always think you just got to distinguish between two things. One is the power of China today is a fact, and it's a perfectly justifiable fact in the sense of it's a large population country, ancient civilization, huge economy. China is and should be one of the great powers of the world for the 21st century. The problem is the system is a different system. And whereas I think when you and I were in office, there was not an expectation exactly, but a hope that as China opened up and developed, then political development, not in terms of turning into a Western style democracy, but political evolution in the direction of more liberalism. I think that was our hope, and possibly it was my actual expectation. But you've got to say in the last few years, there's there's been more external aggression and more internal repression. So that's just a fact. So that's what we're dealing with now. And I think the strategic relationship is very important to define, because you need America and Europe to work together. I think it would be bad if, as it were, Europe is kind of navigating between the US and China. And I think that strategic framework has to accept that there will be areas of confrontation, and you've just mentioned some now. There are inevitably areas of competition. Technology is going to be one. But you need to leave some space for cooperation. Because whether it's the pandemic or indeed what we'll talk about a bit later, climate change, none of these problems can be solved today without the participation of China. And, therefore we've got to, I think the analogies with the Cold War are kind of misplaced. And indeed, as some of the Bloomberg documents show for the forum, I mean, decoupling is going to be painful for both of us, for the West and for China. So I think this, if you can get as you rightly say, if the new president comes in and has a more strategic framework, then you can identify, consistent with that, areas of cooperation, and at least offer China the possibility, whatever differences there are, for those areas of cooperation to be fruitful for both sides.
I agree with that. I also think we can strengthen our negotiating position, if you will, or our cooperating position by reestablishing the relationships that we had with other countries in Asia and Southeast Asia in particular, who were our allies, who would have been the principal partners in the trade deal that President Trump killed, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Whether the new administration chooses to revive that or not, we can clearly do more to strengthen our partnership and work with them. And we have to recognize and just level with people, the old Chinese system, which was by no means a democracy, still guaranteed enough debate and play and openness because there was a regular rotation of leadership. And now that it appears that a person is in charge of China who intends to stay there for life, in essence, that changes things. But we shouldn't accept or assume that it's all going to be bad without working to make it better. We got to try to, we got to give the new administration a chance to articulate an approach and then try to achieve, in cooperation with Europe and the United States and the international bodies, a strategic partnership which will enable us to do good things together and try to minimize the bad things that we think will happen if we just walk away. Sure.
And what do you, if you think about the Biden presidency and the foreign policy shifts, one obviously that we would like to see this side of the water is towards the transatlantic alliance. I mean, do you think that's likely and on the cards? Because one of the things that I thought all the way through this pandemic is, if you think back to the time where you and I were in power, or indeed when President Bush was in power and I was in office, there would have been a constant dialogue on what we could do together, how we handled it, what was the right strategy, and that there would have been a sense of America and the European side sticking together.
I agree with that. And I think, look, I don't want to say too much right now because over on our side of the Atlantic, the current government in America is blocking a normal transition. And so it's slowed down the ability of the president-elect and his team basically to announce a whole slew of projects, because they need to get in there, see what facts they need to see, and do basic things. And I think that the less other Americans say about all this, the better, until the new president and his team have a chance to first be announced and then lay out their policies. But if you look at the life that Joe Biden lived as, you know, is the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, is the chairman of other committees and Judiciary Committee in Congress, as someone who was deeply involved and supportive of the peace process that you had so much to do with in Northern Ireland. Just generally, it's clear that he's going to be more oriented toward working with and through a lot of these international organizations, and that he believes in NATO and he believes in strengthening all this. I also think that all Americans now have shown, and the president-elect has shown, both an appreciation for our security responsibilities around the world and a reluctance to get our soldiers involved again in endless conflicts, which will never produce a satisfactory result from our point of view. But on the other hand, we can't walk away from manifest, urgent, immediate human suffering we have a chance to alleviate. So there's still going to be a lot of hard decisions to make, of the kind that we had to face in Bosnia and Kosovo and lots of other places. These hard decisions won't go away. But I think the less we say right now, the better, because we want to leave them as much maneuvering room as possible.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I guess that's true.
We know what it's like to be second guessed.
I do.
At least you're the second opinion instead of the first.
I know. I was thinking when you were talking about the peace process, the picture behind me is actually a picture from a mural in Northern Ireland, which expresses the differences between the two sides. But fortunately, that's a process which, of course, you had an immense amount to do with, by the way. I'll never forget, in the middle of that peace negotiation for the Good Friday Agreement, when I'd literally lost all track of time. And I remember phoning you once, and I think it was like 3:30 in the morning, Washington, D.C. time. And you were pretty chirpy, actually. I explained the situation.
It's easy to be happy and energetic. We had great partners. Two of whom we've lost just lately. You know, that's another important thing. I think this is something you can do when you're like us. You've been out a while. We lost John Hume, and we lost Martin McGuinness. And then in the Middle East, one of our partners, Saab Erekat, recently died because of COVID. And the thing I want to say about that is that time passes quickly. And when you're in office and you're thrilled with the challenge of each new day and filled with the challenge of each new day, if you're not careful, it'll pass even more quickly. And I think that, you know, I think it's a good thing that Joe Biden is not a kid. I think it's a good thing that he's much older, a generation older than we were when we took office, because we need now a sense of husbanding our time and devoting it to the major challenges of the moment, and not to be distracted and not to be drugged down. And I think that it's a psychological advantage that he's older now.
Well, we could do a bit of that husbanding here, obviously, in the UK, where at the end of the year we'll actually do Brexit in a practical way. We've done it legally already, but Britain will leave the trading system of the European market at the end of this year. Is going to be a huge challenge for us. But I think, you know, once that is done, we're going to have to set about then reconstructing the basis upon which we can play a part alongside other European countries in dealing with some of these big issues. And one of them obviously will be climate change, because we've got in Glasgow, we've got the conference not this December, next December. And this, I think, will be a very, very good opportunity for the world to come together and to show that, in a sense, we've learned the lessons of the pandemic, right?
I agree with that. I think that I think that dealing with climate change in a cooperative way offers the single most constructive opportunity we have to avoid excessive divisive nationalism and denial of science, and to embrace cooperative operations that could create opportunity everywhere and resist the kind of burdensome inequality that we see in parts of America and that you have seen in reaction in Europe to what happened after the crash in 2008 and then what produced Brexit. I think that climate change is both our great long-term challenge, it's really an immediate challenge, and our greatest opportunity to find ways to bring each other along together and lift everybody up. If we do this climate change thing right, if we establish the financial institutions, the investment patterns, the serious scientific-based analysis of the various opportunities that exist, even in a relatively compact space like the UK, to do what will maximize economic and social benefits as well as the long-term environmental emergency, I think it can really work. And there's enough support for that. If you look at the public polls in America, even a lot of President Trump's supporters thought it was a serious problem and ought to be dealt with and was an opportunity to grow the economy and bring economic activities places which hadn't had any new activity in too long. We have to hope anyway.
No, I am quite hopeful on it, actually. I think there are two interesting things that give us potential for a better politics for the future. One is that both with COVID and with climate, it's obvious that there is a problem that can only be met by people working together, can only be met on the basis of evidence, working with science, can only be met on the basis that we recognize that the interests of one or the interests of all are intimately linked. So it's a great rebuttal, in a sense, to the easy type of populism that just rides the anger of grievances rather than trying to provide the answer. And then I think the second thing, and I think this is true of the pandemic, but also true of climate, is that the only solution ultimately to climate change is going to be accelerating the science and technology. And you and I know, because of the work we both do today, now in Africa, the population of Africa is going to double in the next 30, 40 years. And they're going to develop. And to develop, they need power and electricity. They need infrastructure. They need connectivity to the world. So they need to be able to grow sustainably. So whatever America does and Britain does, and we should try and lead the way, we're going to have to develop the means of growing sustainably. And so it places a huge emphasis on this technology revolution that I think is the biggest fact going on in the world today, and which should make a much greater impact on politics. But the important thing about it is that it can only be done by a form of politics that is practical, that sees the advantage in cooperation, and that is the opposite of some of the populist mantras we've seen dominate politics in the last years.
I agree with that. I think, that science-based inclusion that includes economic, social, and personal inclusion is going to be key to all of this. If you look at, we talked about the difference between the U.S. and China and UK and EU and China in political terms, but look at one cultural thing. Look at the difference in results in dealing with COVID. And not look just at China, but at South Korea, a country that is politically much more like our countries. Both of them have death rates that are between 1 and 10% of the death rates that we have experienced. So I think we have to be, none of us can get all huffy and all arrogant. We got to think about this as a great opportunity and one that we can only seize together. That's my bottom line.
Well,
and thank you. Maybe
I hope the optimism we both displayed is justified. But I always think if you can't be optimistic, you shouldn't be in politics. It's a lot of the problems arise when people have got no belief in the future, and you take a step back. Despite all the challenges, the world gets better.
If you look at the trend lines for the last 30 years, the underlying trend lines are far more positive than negative. It is true that whenever the economic paradigm changes, there's a big new concentration of wealth, and we have to unpack that in ways that are productive and inclusive. It is true that we are facing a millennial or more challenge from climate change, but still the basic trend lines have been positive, and we know we can deal with this. It's just a question of whether we will. And you and I, we got to bet that we will. We have grandchildren now.
Yeah, I know. Sure. I never thought I'd be happy to call granddad, but anyway, I am.
Thanks, Tony. Bless you.
Okay. Thanks very much, Bill. All the best.